Up next is our focus on business data. Hotly anticipated, so we stuck it a little later in the program so you'd all stick around. Today we have three people joining us. We have Nate Baum-Snow from the Rotman School at University of Toronto. We have Huju Liu, Senior Economist at Statistiques Canada. And moderating for us for this panel is Mike Veal, Principal Investigator for the network and Director of the Productivity Partnership, which is very involved with the business data. So Mike, I'll let you start your show.
So as Grant said, one of the most exciting developments in Canadian data access has been increased access to business data. And we have two speakers with us today who have been very involved with that. I'm going to give very brief introductions because I want to give them as much time as possible to speak and for you to ask questions of them. The first speaker will be Nate Baum-Snow, and he's a professor of economics, analysis, and policy at the Rotman School of Business. He also holds the Premier's Research Chair in Productivity, and his PhD is from the University of Chicago. And also we have Huju Liu. He's an economist at Statistique Canada, a longtime contributor to the productivity literature, and his PhD is in economics from Western University. So please go ahead, Nate.
All right, thanks very much. I'm going to share some slides here and talk a little bit about my use of the Canadian Employer-Employee Dynamics database, the SEED. And I want to thank my co-author, Nicolas Gendron-Carrier at McGill, for helping me with not only doing this research, but also with the French translation of the slides. So the SEED, really, the parts of it that I've used are mostly the firm level data on corporations, but there's also linkages to workers, information about non-workers, and a separate database of business owners that I think is actually really useful and has a lot of potential for great research projects. So this is derived from tax records, and that gives the data a lot of advantages that I think we don't see in other types of employer-employee match data and firm level data. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of what I see as how you would go about starting to use this data and the things to look out for in using it, because I think it has a lot of really useful information, but there are some things that I would have loved to have known as one of the first users before getting into it. So in Canada, on tax forms, firms typically report information under the sort of organization of the General Index of Financial Information, the GIFI, which is a document you can get, which has lines. And ultimately what you're getting in the SEED is reports by each firm on specific lines. So I highly recommend looking at the GIFI before putting in a request to get access to the SEED, where you can actually request specific reporting lines. And moreover, when doing that, pay close attention to which lines are required and which lines are filled out by small firms with low gross revenue and assets, as these amount to most of the firms in the data set. And that's known as the GIFI short. And that's something I wish I had done at the beginning, but didn't pay as close attention to as I would have. So I hope other researchers using this data will pay more attention to that than I did. I have found that using kind of the non-labor inputs part of the data has been less successful than the labor inputs part, especially because of this GIFI short and the small firms reporting. Sort of data on different types of non-labor inputs is not broken out very well. And I had a particular interest in real estate and building assets that just did not pan out so well. And the capital shares, when calculated and compared to like other sources, I had a hard time getting to match up. So for doing like productivity, TFP estimation, total factor productivity estimation, that leads to some challenges. Maybe they can be solved. I didn't put a lot of effort into solving them, but it's not straightforward. Let's just put it that way. On the other hand, the information on firm sales or revenue, employment, and payroll seem really, really high quality and really, really useful, and maybe better than you could get from any other source, certainly for Canada, but also for other countries. So the main focus and application for the research that I've been doing with the SEED is to try to estimate very local productivity spillovers between firms. And that is about location, getting the location right. So we're looking within postal codes, at the block level, that sort of level of geography. And one of the great advantages of the SEED is actually that Stats Canada actually knows this information and has the geocodes and the postal codes for all of the firms. Now, for researchers like us, they did not give us exactly that information, but we were able to get kind of an anonymized postal code with a distance matrix at 25-meter distance bands. And that worked quite well for our research application here. And that's the sort of thing I think you don't find in other firm level data sets for other countries that have the whole population of firms. And actually my PhD student who graduated last year was involved in doing this geocoding and getting it set up. So I was lucky to have some sort of inside information about what was going on there. The other, I mean, one slight drawback of the SEED is you don't know a lot about establishments. All you know about is whether a firm has multiple establishments or not, and no location information or like employment, payroll, that sort of thing is broken out by establishment. And that, I think if there was one thing for our project, at least, that I wish we could have had, it would be that establishment level data, at least something. So, I don't know if that's possible. It probably would mean merging to another data set, but if that could be on the agenda for the future, I think that would be a great enhancement to the SEED. The individual level information, so I have another kind of related research project trying to estimate productivity spillovers between workers, both in residential locations and in work locations. And one of the things that's really nice about the individual side of the data set, not only is it linked to the firm side, but you actually can see the postal code where people live, which will be anonymized if Stats Canada provides it, but can get some information on where they live, where people live relative to each other at least. And that has been really useful for us. And you can see all the members of the family. And so it can get handle on labor force participation, because this is from tax records, and even people who are not working are filing taxes. One thing I missed that I shouldn't have the first time around was asking for the start and end month of specific jobs. There is no hours information available. That's pretty common for tax data. And there is all this information available about immigrants, which I think there's a lot of research potential there to do some really interesting and important work on the role of immigrants in the economy, and kind of using the linkages between the worker data and the firm side to do that. I guess if I had, I don't have a lot of requests or sort of ideas for improvement here. One I would say is you don't have a lot of information about education or sort of demographic background, and having a link to census and labor force survey data, that would be really useful. I know in the US, for example, they've done this between the LEHD and the Census ACS now just recently, and that's opened up a lot of potential for good research projects. So as I said, I kind of have these two projects using the SEED. One we're revising for the American Economic Review now, and it's about estimating the magnitudes and nature of local spillovers between single location firms at very local scales. And we're primarily using the revenue, employment, and payroll data for these firms to do this. And we use that to both estimate productivity spillovers and document patterns of sorting on firm quality across neighborhoods within Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And then we have this second project, which is about estimating spillovers between workers at residential and work locations, where we're using earnings as the key outcome variable. So as I said, I think the detailed location information is really unique, and that's really useful for us. The fact that you have full populations rather than just samples allows for doing some stuff you couldn't do with other sort of somewhat analogous data sets. I think there is a lot of potential in the detailed tax accounting information that we certainly haven't exploited, but could be exploited in other research projects. And I just don't see another data set out there that has this sort of location information, this sort of family relationship information, and the population. And that, I think there's just great potential for really wonderful research projects coming out. So I guess if I want to just spend the last few minutes on challenges that I guess, I see potential for things to move forward on and make the process a little bit easier in the future. I think the biggest, maybe for us, because we were kind of guinea pigs on this, we were one of the first research teams in using the seed, was we kind of had a bit of a moving target on the computing infrastructure. And I have experience, I have another project using the US Census and ACS data in their data center. And so I kind of see what else could be done. And I think, the way it's definitely been an improvement here, moving from having to be in Ottawa to being able to access the seed from the RDCs and not have to run batch submit jobs. The one thing is we have, and you'll find that you'll have researchers that have a lot of computationally intensive kind of jobs to run. And the only way I could figure out to do that was to buy a dedicated computer for the RDC that I could then, so I wasn't hogging computer resources of others. And I think ultimately having a remote computing cluster with remote access would be really great and improve the research productivity. That's what I've been doing for this project in the US. And it's really kind of a pleasure to be able to sit at in my parents' condo in Brookline, Massachusetts, and work on the US Census data. I can't do it from Canada, unfortunately, but having something like that for the Canadian version of the data would be great, and I think it would free up resources, and that would be great for everyone. But really, this has been, and the other thing is just knowing about the Giphy and knowing about what's possible. So in conclusion, I'd say, the seed is a wonderful resource for researchers. It's really unique in lots of ways relative to other peer type data sets around the world. I think there's lots of really groundbreaking research potential to come out of the seed. Here are some things that would be nice to have, but as it is, it's a wonderful data set to use, and it's really been a pleasure working with all the folks at Stats Canada, getting to know people throughout the organization, and allowing this research to go forward. Thanks a lot.
So thanks very much, Nate. And let's go to Huju.
Thanks, Mike. Share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. All right. Let's try to, all right, let's just bear me for a minute. So I'll just try to move the all right, thanks everyone. Thanks Mike, and thanks Nate. Yeah, I'm glad that see to make some difference for your research, and I have written down all your questions, and then I can discuss with my colleague and how we can improve the database. So today my talk will be give some brief introduction, description of what we have as Statistique for the research on the firm level. So it won't be very detailed. It's just more kind of like a broad introduction. So as Statistique, we have two type data, microdata, and one is, of course, is traditional survey-based data. This comes from a random sample, either it's cross-sectional or longitudinal design. Information is coming from the survey respondent. So I gave you two examples here. You can look up from the Statistique website, and also the link here is actually the whole list of the samples available. It's survey available at Statistique Canada. But today my talk is mainly focused on the second type, which is data development we have been doing over the past few years on using the administrative data and or alternative data. So for this activity, we basically involve a lot of the data linkage integration across multiple data source. And then as a result, because of using from the administrative data, so we come with a large sample size, and most time the firm is longitudinal, as we have unique ID to track them. And this activity is also one of the core function at the my division, which is economic analysis division at Statistique Canada. So for doing all this data integration, so we have relied on various administrative data source. One of the so here's the list of the data source we use. So business register is mainly basic at the universe of the all active business in Canada collected by Statistique Canada. And then we rely on the T1, of course, individual tax return for individual information, and the T2 corporation tax return, which give us the information on income, expense, and asset liability, all those information as Nate has discussed. We also have the payroll information from either T4 and or the payroll deduction PD7, which is monthly payroll information we get from CRA. We also have the trade data, either import and export at the enterprise level, and we including the information on the destination country and source country, and also the product, the commodity product we import exported. We have we use the longitudinal immigration database to provide information on immigrants, and we also recently have some data from different federal department agency. For example, we have the during the COVID, we have the COVID-19 government business liquidity support program data, microdata database, and we have the government innovations growth support database, and also we have the business bankruptcy data from the Office of Superintendent of Bankruptcy. We also recently purchased the patent data from the European Patent Office, PASTAT, to supplement some information on the patent. So here is basically so this is show you the the activity we're doing. So in the middle, you see this is the core database we rely on. We created. That's basically give us the the frame, the structure for all the business in Canada, and then around that circle, that's all different specific database that provided some information on particular domain, right? For example, the patent database, the COVID support database, the business innovation and growth database, business closure opening database, bankruptcy data, and diversity and skill data, and the others. Okay, so and then in the next few minutes, I'll just talk about it for each one of them. So in the center, right, this is the core database, which is basically providing most of the information for all the business. So we call this National Account Longitudinal Microdata, NALF. This is as a result of data linkage based on the BR, T2, T4, PD7, and trade data. It is at enterprise level and cover all the corporation who file T2 return, and also the some of the unincorporated business with employee from 2000. It had information on age, industry, income, balance sheet information, R&D, investment, and also country ownership. It is longitudinal for most business, of course. There are some scenario where we do see the ID change. For example, when the ownership change or the legal structure change or the merger acquisition activity. So far we have using kind of a labor tracking method. Basically look at the employment before and after the change to create a predecessor and a successor file for every pair every year. So try to to tracking the business over time. The second core database is a business research microdata called BRM. This is just the extraction of the NALF, and then including only for corporation. What's different from the NALF is just in that this database, we're including more the derived and analytical variable from our own research analysis. For example, we including multiple variable on the productivity, the measured productivity, investment, R&D, and also the trade data. So this is already available in RDC, and then the updated version up to 2020 will be released soon. In this new release, we're also including data on the patent and the robot at firm level. A third core database we have is the database for the unincorporated business. So because all the previous database has been talking about most cover for the corporation. No, we still have the a gap for unincorporated business. So this file will cover all the unincorporated businesses, including self-employed individual. Proprietorship and also partnership from 2005. Similar is provided information on the income expense. Not much information on the asset and liability as in the GIFI. Okay, now I'm moving to the the kind of the satellite. I call it satellite-based database. The first one is the Canadian Patent Research Database. This is the linkage between the European Patent Office, the PatStat database, and the NALF. It's including the patent application by the Canadian resident business from various patent office around the world, including Canada, US, EU, and Japan, etc. So it's global. It's not just from Canada. Information including on the application authority, whether that the patent has been granted, the technical nature of the patent. The linkage rate is pretty good. So far as we have 90% of the business can be linked to the NALF. So I put a link here so you can. It's a good article that's show how the database has been constructed, and also a few basic statistics from this database. If you're interested, you can take a look. The second satellite database is related to diversity and scale. This is derived from the the Canadian employee database. It's available from 2005. It's basically provide information on the composition of the business owner and the workforce within the business. For example, it includes information on whether the business is majority owned by male or female owner, or it's by immigrants, or by different age group, and also including information on whether the owner has previous business experience or previous labor market experience, which defined by the similar industry, right? Experience working in the same industry as the business. However, one thing I want to mention is that when you work with the business ownership data, keep in mind that the business ownership is only for the private owned business. In other words, the publicly traded company, they are not required to report the owner information to the CRA, and therefore we don't have information on them. The third database I want to talk about is the monthly opening and closing database. So before the pandemic, we already producing the annual and the quarterly data on the firm entry exit and also the job creation and destruction. Since the pandemic, there's a lot of great need on the more timely data on the business opening closing as a result of the pandemic. To respond to that, so we create the monthly business opening and closing database. This is based on the BR and also the monthly payroll information. Essentially, we look at the changing in the month-to-month employment. So using that month-to-month employment change, we can define a business opening or closing. For example, opening business will be a business has employment this month, but not previous month. Of course, this can be resolved as a completely new entrant, right? Or because of the a business is existing business, but just reopening the business from month to month. So there are some table available on the Statistique website. The first link, this is provided estimate of the opening closing for the entire Canada by the province and by even going down to the CMA level. And also there's article to look at the characteristic of the business that's closed during the pandemic using this database. The fourth database is a micro database that's including the government liquidity support for the business during the pandemic. So we have received microdata on multiple support during the pandemic, including the wage subsidy, the business account loan, the rental assistance or rental subsidy. And we have information on whether a business received this type of support, and then if you receive the amount of the loan or subsidy. For some program, we even have the multiple period information, for example, for the wage subsidy program and also for the rent subsidy program. So this information is useful for, basically to evaluate the impact of the government support on the firm's survival and performance during the pandemic. So we have published 2 articles on using this data. First one is to estimate the impact of the wage subsidy program on the business survival and the growth during the pandemic. And the second paper is to look at how the business has been using the wage subsidy program during the pandemic. The next one is some new data we received from the Office of Superintendent of Bankruptcy, including all business that file for insolvency under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act. It's including the type of the insolvency proposal, the filing date, the creditor meeting date and discharge date, and a select variable. It's coverage from 2000 to 2022. Actually, we have received the data every week, and there's some ongoing work in-house to look at examine the trend of the in bankruptcy filing and how the firm characteristic can relate to the business file for insolvency. The last one is related to the business innovation and the growth support database. So that is a synthesis of the government support activity, either financial or service-based, for business innovation and growth from entire federal government. This database has been linked to the BR and another linkage environment in Statistique, linkable file environment by the Center of the Business Special Project. It's cover all the federal department and agency, and it has information on the value of the support received and what type of support and from which department, which program. Again, this is useful for program evaluation and also assessing the impact of the innovation program on the business growth and performance. Here also to link to briefly introduce the database, and also there's also article to examine the impact of this program on the manufacturing firm. Okay, I also wanted to, in the end, I wanted to bring up two latest development for the database. The first one is longitudinal business database. As I discussed before, we have put some effort to tracking the firm over time longitudinally, but it's not perfect. So the lots more effort has been put to improving that longitudinal linkage. One of them is called longitudinal business database. This is basically longitudinal representation, the BR. So BR is cross-sectional, and then now this can add a different dimension, which is create a longitudinal link for the business. It's create this longitudinal link between database based on the continuity rule proposed by the UNUCE, which is based on the continuity of the business production. I think in the practice, before we using only look at employment over time. Now, in addition to the employment change before and after the change, we also look at the changing in address, changing industry code, changing in what the other ownership, business ownership, and other information. Let's combine all the different factor and then decide whether the business is is the same business or different business. This can support research on the business dynamic, right? So if you wanted to look at the entry, exit, and the growth or merge acquisition, this will be pretty helpful. The second development is on the diversity and the scale database. We still have lots of data gap in terms of information on the ownership by racialized group and indigenous status. So we have ongoing project to do that, and then basically we're using linking the seed to the census to try to impute for the business ownership by the different underrepresented group. Education, as Nate point out, that education is another data gap in the seed database. So we have ongoing work as well to link the census to the seed and to try to impute the distribution of education and occupation at the firm level. Okay, so you can control that, in your research. Due to the technology adoption, especially during the pandemic, the landscape, the scale has been changed dramatically. So in response to that, we also try to estimate the scale demand at firm level using the online job posting data. And that's it. And if you have more questions, you can send email to me. And then thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. And people can start typing any questions they want to in the chat. But while we're waiting for that, I'll start out with a couple of questions, I think. At first, it's a comment to Nate. You probably know this, but maybe it'll be useful for our audience to hear this as well. It's unfortunate, but I believe in the first round of remote access, probably the seed will not be an accessible data set because it's still regarded as too sensitive. There may be fixes for that in the future, but not just at the moment. But I can tell you, I think some good news is that the new developments will give you access within the RDC to high performance computing that will be available at the hubs. And that will speed things up a lot in terms of work. I realize you work with really big data sets. So that would be something that might be useful to you. The second thing, I actually want to just a quick question. We're mostly concentrating on data content today, and that's great. But I think my view is that for the productivity policy space, spillovers are sort of all important. And so you didn't have much chance to talk about your actual work. I thought maybe you could just give a very quick reason for your work and explain that in the context of the spillover analysis.
Right. So I think we kind of the motivation is we see a lot of concentration of economic activity in space, firm concentration, but we don't have at least to this point, very good estimates of the extent to which that concentration really reflects spillovers between firms or just certain places that are particularly productive or have good labor supply conditions, for example, near the train station, near highway interchanges, that sort of thing. And that's why we see that concentration in those locations. So I think there was a space, an opportunity with the seed to estimate these sorts of local spillovers. And basically the way we do it is we use the panel structure of the data and the fact that you see transitions between firms over time that expose incumbent firms to different sort of neighbors. And we use that sort of variation to estimate the magnitude of productivity spillovers. And what we find is for high-skilled services, that's NAICS 5, we find sort of the average firm gets about 2% of their revenue and TFP from, I'm sorry, the average spillover elasticity is 2%. That is, if you were to double the average quality of neighboring firms, a firm would get about 2% more revenue or TFP, which seems like a reasonable number. But maybe more interesting is that you actually find that this is very nonlinear, that the firms that impart the biggest spillovers are by far the most productive firms, and the firms below the median are not really imparting any spillovers at all. And then the other thing you see is a lot of very strong assortative matching of high productivity firms co-locating and presumably benefiting from each other's spillovers. Another sort of exercise we did was we tried to see if there's like sort of aggregate returns. That is, if you make a business district put twice as much economic activity in there, but hold, in some sense, the number of firms constant, how that relates to improving the number of firms of the same distribution of qualities. And really what we find is that the spillover process is much more about linear means than about aggregates, which is something that hasn't really been recognized before. And so I think there's some interesting policy implications to come out of this about thinking about, the extent to which we should encourage sort of clustering of businesses and incentivize it. And if you're interested, we can talk more about that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really helpful. And so the other thing that I think came right out in your talk, and I don't know whether Huju has anything to say about this, because I think it is a really difficult problem, and that is to measure capital. And partly the issue is, I don't think it's kind of all that easy, even if you had information that you could imagine businesses reporting, to know exactly how that translates into a capital measure. But I know that Huju has encountered this in his own work, and you've obviously encountered it as well. Do you have any insights as kind of where we might go on improving that aspect?
So I guess I would say the thing about measuring capital one thing about it that's really hard is the conceptual measures we have are very different from the tax accounting measures that are reported by firms. And there's lots of reasons that firms are going to report usually less capital than they actually own, in some that we want to think of them as owning in some conceptual sense. So you kind of end up having to make up numbers. But there's a whole world of TFP estimation, total factor productivity estimation out there that, you know, uses book values that are reported and has gotten some traction on that. I think mostly the reason that that traction exists is that's mostly been done with manufacturing firms where capital, you know, machinery and structures is actually sort of more central to the production process. And a real challenge is as the economy moves away from manufacturing and especially oriented towards high-skilled services, you know, the whole idea of what capital is, I think, kind of has to change. And I think so fundamentally, I think it's kind of a conceptual challenge, maybe even more than a data challenge.
Yeah,
that's where I've come down on this.
I think so too. But Huju, I know we're not giving you a softball question here, but what do you think about the measurement of capital?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's something, you know, actually we're going after. We know, maybe even for us within, you know, in-house, we have some hard time to estimate the TFP for the firm. Sometimes we get a negative coefficient. But bear in mind that, you know, the capital report from the tax is really based on the tax purpose, right? So they try to, you know, what they report is try to minimize, you know, the tax owning, and the depreciation rate is also different. One way we think is maybe linking the different survey. There's one survey called in Statistique Canada called Capital Expenditure Survey. That's basically asking the firm how much investment they have been made, you know, in each year. By linking that to the main data, we can maybe compare the trend, compare the variation, and maybe do some imputation based on the linkage. So yeah, stay tuned.
Yeah, well, that's actually quite a good answer if that works out. I think that sounds like certainly a promising avenue to pursue. So thank you very much, Nate and Huju. This is a really excellent session. I think Grant will be in for us soon, but nonetheless, really, really interesting session. And of course, as you probably know, I'm really interested in these areas, and I hope to talk to you both in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Mike, Nate, and Huju for your presentation.